Okay, I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Boulder Valley Board of Education for today, Tuesday, January 9th, 2018. Laura, would you please call the roll?
Benford. Fuqua.
Here.
Garcia.
Here.
Gebhardt. Here. Marquis.
Here.
Myers. Here. Sargent.
Here.
Okay, please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I'd like to remind everybody that the mission of the Boulder Valley School District is to create challenging, meaningful, and engaging learning opportunities so that all children thrive and are prepared for successful, civically engaged lives. And also to wish you a Happy New Year as we start 2018. And we'll start with the superintendent's report.
Well, I have quite a pleasure tonight because, board members, did you realize that January is Board of Education Month? So I get the opportunity to pay tribute to you tonight. So the first thing I'm going to do is read you two short paragraphs from CASB that speak to how important they think school board members are. But more importantly, I'm going to tell you what I think about you. So first of all, January 2018 is School Board Recognition Month, a great time to focus on the crucial role board members play in our communities and in our schools. As citizens who serve children and represent their communities, school board members face complex and demanding challenges. And CASB believes all Coloradans should recognize the vital contributions these elected public officials play in the education of our children. And they would also like to honor all of you. So here's my honoring of our Board of Education. First of all, remember that I've been doing this for 13 years. I have quite a basis of comparison. I have worked with a lot of school boards, and I have to say, I tell people on a regular basis how fortunate I feel that I get to work with you all. I think you are an amazing Board of Education for several reasons. First of all, like all boards, you work for free, and I think it's pretty amazing. You work for free, you're here a lot, you show up when you need to show up, you ask great questions, and I think it's not always easy, and I think you do it with grace and dignity. Another thing I like about this board is your intellectual curiosity. Sometimes you ask me questions that I just go, I don't have a clue, but I can usually walk down the hall and find somebody who does, and so you make me think. Your intellectual curiosity makes all of us better. You make our communities better by modeling public service and by modeling care for our children. And you are really, really remarkable in that regard. You always bring those topics up, and I think that really matters. You have spirited thinking, and you have spirited disagreements, but that spirited thinking and those spirited disagreements lead us to some very good results for Boulder Valley's children. You are forward-thinking, and you are leaders. I'm honored to be among the 7 members of this board. You are thoughtful and creative. You give of yourselves continuously so that Boulder Valley is one of the best school districts in the country. And I just have to say thank you.
Okay, well, that was a great superintendent's report. And thank you so much, Dr. Stevenson. That's really flattering. So now we'll move on to board comment. It's probably an opportune time. Would anyone like to start? Oh, and by the way, we're going to do board comment, and then we will separately go and talk about any thoughts we wanted to share around the conference we went to at CASB. All right, so you don't need to put those together. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't have public participation this evening. Is that correct?
No one has signed up for public participation.
Okay, sorry about that. So, all right, so, oh, and I forgot to ask questions to the superintendent, didn't I? I did. All right, let's just do it as a comment. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Board comment. Anyone? Okay. Kathy?
I just want to share that today, and there was another meeting in mid-December, the Legislative Interim Committee is meeting on school finance, and so I listened in today to today with public comment, and the superintendents presented, and I just think it's going to be a really interesting session to see what happens with, they can come forward with a new school finance proposal. There's a lot of talk around what they can do to maybe have a separate measure to actually raise taxes, so it'll be an interesting session to follow what the interim committee's doing. They set themselves up a 2-year timeline, so they aren't going to get a whole lot done from the interim committee for this year. I think they're still trying to gather information, and it was nice that they set up time today for public comment. They set up probably, 4 or 5 hours today to just hear public comment. So just thought I'd share that, and as things progress, I'm happy to kind of keep everybody apprised on that.
And I would add to Kathy's comments that we worked all day with the state superintendent, so it makes me a bit giddy being with them all day. But the group did go down and present their initial thinking. So I do think the superintendents are very serious about a new school finance proposal and are really being very thoughtful. So, yes.
They had a good cross-section of Harry Bull from Cherry Creek to Rob from Merino to Walt Cooper from Cheyenne Mountain, and Charlotte Chancho, who represented the Opportunity Coalition. So they had a nice cross-section of students and representation of just the different school districts and different student populations.
Shelley?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you all know that I met with Michelle DeBerry today to talk about the process that the district's going to be using to do the athletic review task force. And I am so impressed with the thinking that Michelle's doing on this. I think it's going to be a great process. And she's invited me to come say a few words at the June 29th kickoff meeting to share the board's vision for why we're doing this. So if any of you have any thoughts that you'd like to share with me that I can sort of incorporate with my own to talk about that night, please send them to me. June 29th. And then it will meet every Monday, the first Monday of the month from 5 to 6:30. So I'm sure any of you are welcome to drop in. I'm not going to be going to every one, but I will be dropping in occasionally. Where is it? I don't know. Somewhere in this building? Yeah. No, January 29th. Oh, sorry, January 29th. And it goes through June. Sorry, it goes through June. Yeah.
Any other comments?
Just want to thank staff and the people who signed up for the Budget Advisory Committee that we're getting started to I think it meets the end of this month or in a couple weeks. So I just want to say thanks for getting that process going. 'Cause I'm looking
Actually,
forward.
it's meeting Thursday.
Okay, and that's this
Great.
month. So thank you to staff and to the people who volunteered their time to step up and to give us the guidance that will be really helpful as we go forward with the budget.
Any other comments, board members?
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank Sandy Replinger for meeting with myself and Kathy to give us a lot of information regarding elementary school enrollment and a bunch of wonderful ideas as it relates to some of the Title I schools and where they're at. And whenever you set up that meeting with your Title I principals, I'm available. Thank you.
Okay, and I think the whole board will be invited to the meeting with the Title I principals, just so you're all aware. That's something I think we talked about it in the setting.
And we actually are trying to set that up for a board meeting in February. So you won't have to come to an additional meeting, but they'll come and do an interaction with you.
Thank you. Okay, any other comments, or are we ready to move on to our CASB impressions? All right, who would like to start?
I think one of the most important things I got from going to the conference was learning the legalities of being on the board. And I know they didn't teach us everything we need to know, but I thought it was really important understanding, what we can and can't do, and what we do in public, and what we can do in private. And I think one of the best pieces of advice I got was never reply all to a board email, because then you've got more than 3 going on at the same time. But it was a great introduction to being a board member. They answered a lot of my questions.
Out of curiosity, did they mention anything about blind copying people on emails? BCC?
Yeah, they said not to.
Yeah, I think that's another good one. Who else would like to share anything from KSB? Sam?
I mean, I might have said this in December, but by far the most interesting session I attended was the session that the Cherry Creek School District did on changing their start times so that they aligned their elementary, middle, and high school start times close to the start times recommended by the health professionals for optimal student learning. As you all know, we have in this district given our schools a significant autonomy on their start times, and it's troubling to me that some of those are significantly earlier than what is best for student health. And so if we're serious about student learning, I hope we would take a look at those start times and look towards a very thorough community process like Cherry Creek did to move towards changing them so they're in alignment with best practices as recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the giant body of research into adolescent biology that shows in some cases we're starting too early and our kids are at a disadvantage because of that. So that was a really impactful session for me, and I'll be talking about that more as the semester progresses here.
Great. Who wants to go next? Donna?
I did enjoy getting to go, and when I saw on our agenda tonight, talk about your takeaways, I brought some physical ones, and one was this little gadget that if you're stressed, you can use it in the classroom. I got that from the vendors passing out things. And then they gave us this cool little cell phone holder, and that was really cool. But more importantly, that's my funny part of tonight. More importantly was just getting to meet with other school board members to talk about their successes and their challenges and see that we're on the right track in a lot of ways. As I sat at breakfast with one of the students, Isaiah, he said his favorite thing was listening to the keynote speaker, Linda Clyett Wayman. And you can actually see the same talk we heard if you Google her name, and she's on TED Talks. But she talked about how she took the school off the the worst schools in the nation list by her leadership and her style. And Isaiah said to me, I cried several times, and I said, so did I, in her talk. It's very passionate. Then there was another talk by Barbara Oakley talking about learning to learn and how our neural pathways are created in our brains, and we can develop cognitive thinking skills even in our older life, and gave some pointers. She failed Algebra 1 and science in high school and had to teach herself how to learn. So it was very interesting for our students that came to hear it, but also for us elderly people to hear it and hear what we could be doing to increase our cognitive abilities. But you can also see the same talk we saw if you Google Barbara Oakley for TED Talks. But those are my takeaways. Thanks.
Thanks. That is encouraging. I missed that talk, and maybe I'll try to see that. I'll share my takeaway. I went to one panel that talked about some of the resources that Greater Education Colorado's prepared. I wasn't aware that they had these district-specific presentations that we can give to our community that give sort of an overview of the financial situation. And I didn't know that I could already go today without a password and pull that presentation off the web. I thought that was really interesting. So who would like to go next?
The highlight for me this year as well as last year is that student breakfast that we have. And I want to thank Mark for setting that up, because I think it's really appreciable and also very enjoying for me to sit across the table with a couple of students and interact with them and learning what they're doing in their own schools and what they're learning in their own schools. And I was sitting across the table with a young lady, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about the issues around, I think she was from Boulder High, the issues around diversity, the issues around inclusion, and how, from her perspective, how important that is and how seriously they take that at Boulder High School. So I truly appreciate that breakfast. Thank you.
I want to echo what you said, Richard. I really enjoyed the breakfast this year and last year and getting the opportunity to meet the students. It makes me wish I could meet more of them, but thanks to Mark and everybody who helped set that up, because that is one of the highlights for sure for me. One of my favorite breakout sessions was one on what's called SCAP, the Student-Centered Accountability Project. That is work that some of the rural school districts are doing on how to revise and reform the accountability system, and to see the passion and the interest around looking at new ways to measure how we're doing in schools, how to hold up schools and the good things that schools are doing, so that we're not just doing test and punish over and over again. So I really appreciated that. They had a video that I've played for my family. Now they're getting a little tired of it, called the what and the why. And you can just, it's a YouTube video and it's really good. So I think we're all doing this for both reasons, the what and the why. It was great. And then just the camaraderie, to get to know other board members, to get to know our board members. Thank you, Cindy, for hosting us for a nice dinner. That was above and beyond, and so thank you for that. So it was, overall, I think it was a worthwhile experience.
So one of the things I like about going to CASB is I always meet up with the group called the Federal Relations Network, and that's 12 or 13 school board reps from across Colorado who go to Washington to lobby for local school districts to our senators and other people in Washington. And so I am not going to be going in February. They're going. I don't go every year. I try and go every other or every third year. But at these meetings, we talk about the standing resolutions and the resolutions that we're going to take to Washington. And so if anyone's interested, it's a fairly detailed document. Let me know, and I can pass along what those resolutions will be this year in Washington. So it's always interesting.
Okay, and so thank you for sharing that. Richard.
Can I go back just to the board communication a little bit more, because I failed to acknowledge the fact that I met with Randy also, and Randy Barber, and Ari, who is the Director of Family School Partnerships, and had a great conversation with both of them around trying to get this Latino Forum going, and I'm waiting to hear what the results are on that, but we're moving ahead on that. We're hopefully we'll get a big one going here soon.
So this was the first year for the CASB conference with a new director. We lost Nancy Weiss last year, and so they're having a meeting with the CASB board at the end of the month for recommendations for the next conference and how to make it better, what kinds of programs to offer, ideas. So if any of you want to pass that along to me, I'm happy to pass that along to CASB for the next conference. So I'd be happy to take any recommendations that you have.
Kathy, would you mind sending an email to the board that asks that, just to remind us that we have that opportunity? Thank you. If there are no other comments, I made a mistake with public participation because, and I'm going to reopen public participation to read this paragraph. This evening, this public comment session will also serve as a public hearing for receiving comments on 2 unified improvement plans that are on our consent agenda later in the evening, as the board will not be asking for public comment during the consent portion of the agenda. So I think you're all familiar with the 2 UIPs. You probably read them, okay? All right. So moving on to our next item, we're going to our first information item, which is the review of school board open meeting requirements and standards of conduct. I think Melissa's going to join us. There it goes.
Good evening, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the open meetings law and the confidentiality issues and standards of conduct for board members. Sounds like maybe Ms. Sargent already heard about several of these issues at the CASB conference. So hopefully a lot of this is a review, and we'll move pretty quickly, but I know Laura printed out the whole presentation, so you can go back and review it, and if you have any questions or there are particular laws that are cited that you want me to pull for you, I'm happy to. So the board has a policy, BBA, and that is your powers and duties policy that pretty much aligns with the law. I mean, it does align with the law, but it's a summary version of your powers and duties. But what I wanted to highlight in this policy is it reiterates the fact that the board acts as a legal body when it's acting as a whole at a legally constituted meeting. So all powers of the board lie in its action as a group. Individual board members exercise authority only as they vote at a legal meeting of the board. So as a board member, you do hold a position of public trust, and therefore you owe a duty, a fiduciary duty to the public, which means that board members carry out their duties for the benefits of the people of the district, rather than as a means of advancing their own personal or financial interest. And so just a little bit of background, when you, as a fiduciary, a lot of times you hear about being a fiduciary in the business world or a nonprofit world, but you also have that duty here as a board member, which is intended to ensure a high degree of care and complete loyalty to the school district, and it encompasses three duties that fall within it. The duty of loyalty, which means putting the district's interest ahead of private interest. Duty of care, devoting the necessary time and attention so you're making informed and reasonable decisions. And a duty of obedience, which is obeying the applicable laws and district policies. So now we'll turn to the open meetings law, and this is a Colorado state law. Right at the beginning of this statute, it talks about the statewide concern and why they enacted this law. The policy of the state is that the formation of public policy is public business and may not be conducted in secret. So that's the umbrella with all the detail that comes below that. So any meeting of 3 or more members of the board is going to be considered a public meeting. And anytime you're discussing public business or taking formal action is going to be a public meeting. So the board has all of your meetings, your regular board meetings, your special meetings, your work sessions and retreats. These are all public meetings within the open meetings law. The issue with telephone conference calls, which you don't see those too much anymore, but certainly the email traffic, that can create, if you have 3 or more members, that can create a public meeting. So that's definitely over the years has become quite an issue in terms of your email communication, the volume of that communication. So a little bit more on that. So when you've got three or more board members, depending on the subject matter, you could be looking at, you have had inadvertently perhaps a public meeting that hasn't been properly noticed. So a series of emails when you're trying to deliberate, or it could be perceived as deliberating toward a decision, and particularly if you're having some kind of discussion on email that's can be easily connected to something that's pending in front of the board for a formal action. One-way email distribution, so blasting something out to everybody else, background or some information item is most likely not a meeting, but again, I would encourage you to exercise caution when you're sending emails to the group. Oftentimes, maybe the information goes out, it feels one way, but it's hard to resist the temptation to respond, and that kind of leads into a discussion. So the procedural matters around open meetings law, this is mostly for Laura in terms of posting 24 hours in advance. We do have to identify the agenda items when we do the notice of meeting, but the language in the statute is where possible, so it is possible to add things within that 24-hour period. But whenever we do know what the items are going to be, we're going to put those on our 24-hour notice. We take minutes during our meeting, and those are pretty high level. And then we do record regular and special meetings at which votes are taken and recorded. Most of you are familiar with the state law began allowing participation electronically in board meetings, and we enacted a policy that provides for that. So if you can't be physically present at a board meeting, the policy does provide only when extenuating circumstances prevent the member from physically attending. And then the policy itself, you'll want to refer to that in terms of the procedures for doing that, letting the superintendent, the board president know it's allowed up to 4 times per year. So now let's talk about executive sessions. So there are 8 matters that can be considered an executive session away from the public. And I'll just hit on those 8 topics: the purchase, acquisition, lease, transfer, sale of real estate, personal or other property. Number 2 would be a conference with attorneys for the purpose of receiving legal advice on specific legal questions. 3, any other matters required to be kept confidential by federal or state law. Specialized details of security arrangements or investigations. Determining our positions related to matters that may be subject to negotiations and developing strategy for negotiations. And this does carve out the collective bargaining agreement and employment contracts. That's not going to happen in exec, that's going to happen in a public meeting. Any consideration of documents protected by the the Open Records Act. Discussions about individual students happen in executive session, and then personnel matters as well. So convening an executive session, so this would be primarily left to Tina in terms of following the rules that the board president would be announcing on the record the topics of executive session. We have to identify with those topics with as much specificity as we can. And then the board votes in open session about whether to go into the executive session. So the public is aware of the topics for exec and that the board has voted to convene into exec. And this can happen during any meeting without advance notice in that 24-hour meeting if something comes up on an emergency basis. I think you all are aware that once you've identified the topic that you're going to be discussing in executive session, when you're in the room, you're going to announce the topic and stick to that topic. And then if you've got another topic, you move into that. So you're not going to stray from that. The board's not allowed to adopt any policy, resolution, or take any formal action in executive session. That's going to happen in the public. Only those persons invited by the board may be present. The minutes are very limited to the amount of time spent on a topic. And there is an electronic recording made except for some discussions that are related to attorney-client privilege and discussions about individual students. So a bit more about confidentiality. So discussions occurring during the executive session are confidential. State law requires that each board member sign an affidavit acknowledging this confidentiality, which happens as the new board members come on. The entire board signs that affidavit. So that happens every 2 years. No portion of the record of an executive session is open for public inspection or subject to discovery in any administrative or judicial proceeding unless the board as a whole consents to the release of that information or a judge makes a portion of the record available. So now let's review some of the standards of conduct that apply to board members. So again, an individual board member has no individual authority. So the board takes action, makes decisions only as a full board acting in its corporate role. An individual board member doesn't have the right to speak on behalf of the whole board unless the board has given that person the authority to speak. And again, a caution would be if you're writing as a board member, it's always a good idea if you're not speaking based on your authority given to you by the board, that you say that you're, like, for instance, in a letter to the editor, that you're speaking on your own behalf. So the Colorado law does cover 5 areas of school board member conduct, and I linked up here that our policies cover these. General rules of conduct, ethical principles, disclosure requirements, rules relating to board members' interest in contract involving the school district. And there's even a specific statute about your ability as a board member to serve on a nonprofit entity's board. So the conflict of interest piece is the one that rises up from those duties that I wanted to highlight tonight. As you know, public office is not to be used for the profit, gain, or private interest of any individual. Our board policy, BCB, is really the one that covers the steps for a conflict of interest that you may have. So be aware if you think there may be the potential for a conflict of interest to take a look at that policy. You're going to be abstaining from voting on the matter and also from attempting to influence other board members, so during a conversation about the matter if the board's getting ready to vote. Again, if you're concerned about a potential conflict, I would encourage you to talk to the board president or the superintendent or me, and we'll help you through that. Confidentiality, so state and federal law do protect the confidentiality of student, employee, and many of the school district matters. Obviously not everything. We have the open records law. But anything that is considered confidential must be, each board member has a duty to maintain that confidentiality. One of our board policies, which is cited here, acknowledges that responsibility. The attorney-client privilege, so the attorney hired by the school district and or the board represents the interest of the school district as an entity. So the attorney, including me, I don't represent individual employees of the district or board members of the district. I represent the entity. So if an individual board member disagrees with the legal position taken by the board acting as a whole, that individual board member is still bound by the attorney-client confidentiality and the executive session privileges and wouldn't have the right to divulge the content of that. It's only the board as a whole that can waive any privilege. And just a bit on the Colorado Open Records Act. So public records are defined in this act as all writings made, maintained, or kept by the school district for use in the exercise of functions required or authorized by law or involving receipt or expenditure of public funds. So this definition includes the correspondence of board members. So keep in mind that the emails that you write, the text messages and voicemails could be considered records open to public inspection. They wouldn't be if the content is within one of the exceptions to public disclosure under the Open Records Act, like attorney-client privilege. There's a work product exception, personnel files, student records, or if the content does not involve school district business or the receipt or expenditure of school district funds. Occasionally, just like employees might have emails sitting on their bvsd.org account that are clearly personal, unrelated to school. So just because they're there doesn't mean they're a public record that are maintained for the business of the school district. On the flip side, employees or board members, if emails are sent or received through a private email account, they could be subject to disclosure if they're made, maintained, or kept by the board member in his or her official capacity. So that's something important to keep in mind. And lastly, the board members individually could be subject to civil or criminal liability. Generally, on the civil liability side, the Colorado Governmental Immunities Act is going to protect any action within the scope of your duties, official duties as a board member if you're acting in good faith. The school district is insured, and one of the policies, one of the board policies says that we'll maintain that insurance, and the insurance company will defend and indemnify board members in civil litigation arising from their service. But if a board member is acting outside the board role, they could lose that immunity and the insurance protection. So there's generally an assumption that you're acting in the scope of your official duties. But if sometime along that it's proven that you're not, then that immunity protection is likely going to drop away. And there are some criminal laws that also could be implicated with individual board member conduct if you're failing to perform your fiduciary duty. The district attorney is authorized to bring criminal prosecution, and there are a couple of the criminal laws that would specifically apply to official board members: misuse of official information, official misconduct, and then, of course, embezzlement of public property. So that's a lot of information. If you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Two things you talked about that can only be waived by a vote of the board as a whole, waiving privilege and making something in executive session public. Is that a simple majority vote?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's no requirement for more than just that.
Right. It would, yes.
And what is work product? What would be considered work product?
Well, that's defined in the open records law, and it's usually drafts of things that are prepared for the board before things are finalized and you take actions. So it could be staff documents that are produced that are in a draft form is generally the way that's regarded. So anytime we get an open records request that we're asking you to produce records to us, we do go through all those and make sure that if there are any exemptions that apply, that we'll work through those with you.
Any other questions? And I'll just make a comment. One, this was helpful. I've gone to testify against or for legislation in the past, and if I wanted to introduce myself as a member of BVSD, I did check with everyone that I could give the position I was taking. And if I felt like that wasn't likely, I just presented as myself. And I think that's a really important differentiation, especially when you're going to the legislature and testifying. So
Yeah, I
thank you
agree.
very much. That was very helpful.
You're welcome.
Okay. And so we have another informational item, which is the update of the October 2017 enrollment count and an analysis of the trends observed. And I think Glenn Segru is going to join us.
Thank you. Let me get this called up. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to first go over the growth and changes we've seen this year in overall enrollment and try to put that in perspective with previous years and trends that we've seen, and also delve a little bit into some of the components of change, of growth and decline, and where we've seen it throughout our enrollment. So this is our pattern we've seen over the last 10 years. We did grow this year, which is good compared to last year, which we had a little bit of negative growth. Growth this year measured about 0.5%, which isn't really strong. We'd previously been measuring about 0.8%, and if you take last year out, really even closer to 1%. So our growth overall has been slowing. The chart shows numbers across the top. Those are overall growth for the district. The small white box below that represents the charter growth for the district, which really has been pretty stagnant since about 2009. The way charters are, it's based on seats available, and those have been largely filled up since that time. So there's been very little change in charter since 2009. So the growth that we do see along the bottom are in the general fund schools. This chart looks at just the absolute change that we've seen from year to year. So along the left-hand side, you can see numbers. Those represent the number of students that we gained or lost that year. The yellow line is the BVSD as a whole. The colored bars are the different levels. So we can see BVSD since '07 has largely, save 2008, been near or above the 200 mark in gain in students. A few big pops in 2010 and 13, nearing and above 400. We can see quite a bit of change starting last year, where we had our first negative year in quite some time. This year we rebounded a bit, about almost 150 kids, 141 to be exact, and that it still represents a bit of a slowing trend over time. We can see at the individual levels, we can see that elementary dominated a lot of the growth in the early part of the graph, from '07 to '10, '11. But that has changed. Elementary has since started slowing down in its growth and even starting to turn slightly negative 2015. And we had a very negative year this year, and I can go into some reasons why that happened this year. This chart shows really more of a geographic look at where we see growth by community. Again, absolute terms along the left side, with the yellow line being BVSD as a whole. It's a bit messy, but if you train your eyes on the colors, you can see where we've had growth and decline over the years. The blue bars and the green bars in the first part from Boulder and Lafayette were pretty big generators of our growth during that time frame. We can see that at the elementary level has fallen off over time, and both of those have been more negative in recent years, with Boulder being very negative this year in terms of resident student growth. Many of the other communities were hovering around zero, a little bit above, a little bit below. Superior is notable for its recent declines, which largely has to do with that community really being built in a very short time frame, and those houses are aging through. We saw the initial influx of purchasers and students into that community. We had a lot of portables at the time. We see Superior Elementary for the last 4 or 5 years has started to actually decline as most of those kids have progressed on to middle and high school, and we're starting to see that El Dorado now. In terms of growth, colors aren't as clear on this chart as the originals, but the tall ones here represent Lafayette, Erie, and they have really taken up most of the growth in the district this time. This is mostly due to the new housing construction that we're seeing in those communities. And really overall, some of this chart can illustrate how housing inventories in all of the communities have been affected. Prices are definitely one factor, but as we see in Boulder and Louisville, inventory for single-family detached and existing homes has really plummeted, and most of those homes have purchased up. There's not a lot on the market really available for people who want to buy a single-family detached in those communities. Now this chart goes over the grade sizes by grade level. We call each grade level a cohort in this instance. The bottom level here in 5th grade represents the smallest that class has been in the last 10 years. And the top level here represents the biggest it's been in the last 10 years. Overlaid on that are the white squares, which is this year. So a few things about this chart. We had a very, very small 12th grade class leave this year. So that was really one of the major drivers of our growth this year, with that small class leaving. We also had a very large 5th grade class progress out of elementary and into middle school. That definitely helped middle school growth, but that was one of the major contributors to elementary level as a whole declining by such a large amount. And overall, what we see are, from about 4th grade on, we see all of our cohorts classes are really at the upper end of that spectrum. If I did this presentation 5 years ago, which I largely did do, this chart would be much more mixed. You would see the current years varying much more, and that means we'd have more growth built in the system, more opportunity for smaller 12th grade classes to leave, which helps with growth. We're not seeing that now. We're seeing all of the grades near the top. What we're also seeing on the other end of the scale on the elementary side, we've been seeing very small kindergarten classes lately. Luckily, we've also been seeing very large gains from kindergarten to first grade. Although the kindergarten classes, looking at them by themselves, could be a cause for concern, we've made up for it a lot into first grade. However, we've had about 4 years of this happening now, and we can see that these classes, first through third, are on the lower side, and that is starting to drag on enrollment overall. Out-of-district enrollment, out-of-district has been growing for the most part over the years, really since the 1990s, fairly consistently over the years. We are seeing a bit of a leveling off in the last 3 years or so. We can see that the resident students have been the biggest contributors to overall growth, much more so than out-of-district. But in the last 3 years or so, the out-of-district has been growing at a little lower rate. Not really shown in this chart are the new out-of-district kids that we see, and those have been down a bit the last 3 years as well. So, another major driver of growth is what a demographer might call a net migration, and that's people moving in and out of the district. We don't have perfect numbers that way, but looking at our own student data, we can look at resident students that live here and see the students that appear each year and the number of students that leave. So this does also include students that might be coming in or out of the district to go to private school or homeschool, but for the most part, it does capture the move-ins and move-outs in the district. So a lot of times when I have this discussion in communities and schools, the focus is often on the top line, which represents the number of students moving into the district. But we can also see that the number of students leaving the district plays a very important role as well. And really when we see gains in the district, it occurs when the net migration, which is the arrows represented here, are larger arrows. For a good example is 2011, we actually had a decline in the amount of new kids to the district. However, the number leaving was even plummeted at a greater rate, and we actually had a pretty good net gain that year. So with the current year data, what we're seeing is some leveling off in new to the district, and the net gains have fallen as well. We're still getting them, though. They're still positive. This is consistent with what the state demographer has been saying about job growth and housing in the area, that we did go through a very strong period in the Front Range coming off of the recession, but regional at least, that kind of growth is cooling off, and I think we're seeing some of that here as well. Now birth, this is always a very telling chart. Luckily, we kindergarten classes don't always come in with the same declines that we see with births. During high migration years, we might actually get quite a few more school-age kids come in during there, but we have been coming closer and closer as the year go along to our kindergarten classes matching the birth rates. So we see this, so we have seen falling rates for quite some time now. The most recent trends appear to be also regional in nature as well. Talking to the state demographer, she's mentioning that the recession took a hit on people delaying childbirth, so rates had gone down in most Front Range school districts during this period. And the other factor going into that too is that a lot of the new migrants into the Front Range are younger, entry-level jobs, and haven't really gone into the childbearing years yet. So we're seeing a bit of a gap in BVSD and in the region, and the state demographer feels that may reverse about 2020. But right now we're in a bit of a lull with births. So in summary, enrollment is positive, although slowing at about 0.5%. We did see a significant negative at elementary. That trend was copied at the among the resident population as well. Losses at elementary were fairly uniform across most of the communities, with the exception of Lafayette area, which actually saw pretty significant growth. The influence of cohort or grade level size was strong, with a small 12th grade, outgoing 12th grade, and a large 5th grade going from elementary to middle school this year. Out of district was basically a net, was neutral this year, was level, and net migration was on par with 2016 and positive, but a bit below what we'd been seeing in other recent years. Kindergarten continues to be negative and getting smaller. However, we're seeing strong recoveries at first grade, but we are seeing a little bit smaller classes that are creating some drag at the elementary level. So that's my information. If there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Board members, questions? I have a question. At what point do we look at our enrollment data and compare that to our building capacity to come up with sort of a long-term capacity plan? Is that something that we do on a 5-year basis, or?
It's something we definitely do going into a bond cycle. As one of the first projects to look at is to compare our capacities and where we're going to need capacities and where we have excess capacity. Short of that, we do some spot checking. We have talked about doing a more annual, not probably 5 years, but maybe 3-year review of a comprehensive plan that would look at that more often.
And also, Kathy, you had mentioned you went to a meeting and they were talking about, for the Boulder County area, a 9%?
It was the state demographer.
Cindy, 9%.
Decline in student enrollment for Boulder County over the next, 10 to 15 years? Is that something that you're seeing, that you're anticipating, or is it really hard to tell?
Yeah, I'd like to see that report. I've met with her actually twice this year at some conferences and things and talked to her, and I haven't seen anything that drastic. I do know there are some declines, especially at the lower levels, but overall, the region is supposed to expect some modest growth.
Oh, okay. Donna?
I have a question on, what are your thoughts on kindergarten declining but recovering first grade?
Usually, so you see this from kindergarten to first, and you also see it from 5th to 6th, and also at 9th grade, where big part of that are people coming from private providers and homeschool and making that jump in the system. At kindergarten in particular, there's a number of facilities that provide preschool and kindergarten. And for some families, they may keep their kids at those facilities because they have younger kids in preschool, and that way they can go to one facility. That has been, like I said, on the increase. In 2010, that jump was probably about 60, and now we're seeing it about 150. So that's our best guess that has something to do with that. Yeah.
Other questions? All right. Oh, Sam?
And this might not be for you, but remind me what we're doing for our homeschooled kids. Because weren't these, the Boulder Explore, wasn't that the program for the homeschooled kids that's now at 0? Did we change to something else, or?
I would have to get that information.
Yeah.
Unless
Just
Mark has it,
curious.
which he doesn't look like he does. I'll have
It's
to
all right.
check on that tomorrow.
Just curious what we're doing for them. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, the next item on our agenda is action items and consent grouping, and I'm going to read them off. 7.1 personnel items. 7.2 approval of minutes November 14th, 2017. 7.3 approval of minutes December 12th, 2017 special meeting. 7.4 approval of minutes December 12th, 2017 regular meeting. 7.5 approval of minutes December 19th, 2017 special meeting. 7.6 acceptance of donation Alicia Sanchez Elementary. 7.7 acceptance of donation Fairview High School. 7.8 adoption of policy IHBB gifted education. 7.9 adoption of school priority improvement plans. 7.10 approval of peak-to-peak charter schools request for waiver of state law relating to kindergarten school readiness assessment. 7.11, approval of purchase math consumable instructional materials Follett. 7.12, award of construction contract for bond-funded improvements to BCSIS High Peaks Elementary School. 7.13, closeout to the construction manager general contractor contract for bond-funded work at the Creekside Elementary School. 7.14, contract for real estate services. 7.15, resolution 18-01, respectful workplace commitment. 7.16, resolution 18-02, regarding notice of meetings for the Board of Education. 7.17, RTD contract approval. 7.18, grant Arapahoe Ridge, Boulder Tech, Carl Perkins Voc Tech, Colorado CTE-17. 7.19, grant food service farm to school USDA 17. Okay, that was a long list. Are there any items board members would like to pull from consent grouping?
Yes, 7.8.
Okay. 7.8. And Shelley? Possibly, or should we pull it? Yes, I will. Okay. Okay, so I have 7.14, 7.15, and 7.8. Are there any other items members would like to pull? Okay, hearing none, we are going to begin the discussion for the remaining items on consent. Do I have a motion to approve the remaining items on consent? Sam? Second by Kitty, thank you. Any discussion on the remaining items? I have a question. For the 7.10 approval of peak-to-peak charter schools request for waiver, I am wondering, is that one of the waivers is that typical for charter schools? And also, can districts waive out of that as well, school districts that are not charter schools?
So as far as I know, this is the only waiver that's been requested by a charter for this particular statute in our district, as far as I know. The only one, right, because the Horizons contract was a while ago, and they're the only ones with the younger children. But the school district does have an opportunity to seek waivers, but the process for charters is much streamlined. So I can certainly get back to you about what that would look like, but I know there's a lot more process around public meetings and things like that before you seek a waiver.
Okay, and that was something that came up with our dinner with the legislators, I think, that we do have more opportunities to waive. I have no particular interest in any, but I'm just curious what,
It's just a different process.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about the action items that have not been pulled? Okay, yeah.
On the improvement plan for Columbine, it seemed to focus on the MTSS and the sense I got reading it was that we hadn't implemented MTSS to the full extent that we could have. I'm just curious if I can get a little more information on that, and I can certainly send that. I'm not opposed to it, I was just getting a little more background for that.
So let me clarify. Are you asking whether Columbine has only recently implemented MTSS and not at an earlier time?
Or just what the holes were in it. No, I thought they
Okay.
had it. I think it was just that there were some issues in the implementation of it, was the way I read it, not that they didn't have it.
Okay, okay. Let me look at, see if Sandy has an answer to that. Oh, the principal's here. She can answer that. Yeah, come on up. Bianca, thank you. I'm sure you didn't anticipate this, but I'm so glad you're here.
I'm happy to answer any questions
Okay.
you might have, so thank you. I'm Dr.
Kathy, we have the
Yes.
expert.
We do. I'm Dr. Bianca Gallegos. I'm the principal at Columbine Elementary School, which was also my own elementary school as a child. So I always have to say that because that just shows you my extended love for the school. So yes, to answer your question, We did begin to implement MTSS last year. This year, it's completely implemented, and we expect to see the fruits of that labor.
Are there any specific areas that you are focusing on in the MTSS implementation for this year?
We are implementing, thanks to the support from Sandy, teacher labs, which is going to be really great for the teachers to see the expertise that's within the building and to be able to share the information and the learnings with each other. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on consent grouping minus the 3 items that were pulled? Okay, Laura, do you want to call the roll?
Benford. Fuqua.
Yes.
Garcia.
Yes.
Gebhardt. Yes. Marquis.
Yes.
Myers.
Yes.
Sargent.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, we'll start with 7.8, adoption of policy IHBB gifted education. That was pulled by Donna. Would you like to talk about that? Oh, we need a motion, sorry. Do we have a motion?
I was about to,
Oh, got it. Sorry.
I move to amend IHBB, oh,
Okay, and do we have, can we get a motion to bring the item up?
I motion that we bring I move to bring the item 7.8 up.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I move to amend IHBB by removing the first phrase of paragraph 2 that reads, "To the extent resources are available for this purpose." My rationale for doing this is the state doesn't make serving these students dependent upon available resources, and I hate to leave it open to someone's interpretation of what's available and what are our resources.
Can I second the motion? I second the motion. Discussion?
Yeah, I agree with Donna on this one. It kind of surprised me when I saw that, because it sounds like it's an out, that, oh, if we don't have resources, we don't have to help the talented and gifted kids. And I don't like that.
Any other comments?
Just open to understanding what the rationale was for having that phrase in there, if anybody wants to speak to that from staff.
Sam?
I think you'll find that most districts do have a phrase like that in their policies around special services. And because the only one that's absolutely federally mandated is, of course, special education. And while you want to serve students, there are resource questions. So I think it's taking care of the resource question when you begin to talk about special needs. But I think Donna's point about, we certainly wouldn't want to say we're not going to serve our children. And so,
I thought tag services were mandated.
the services are mandated, but the extent to which you provide them are not mandated. So you would say, to the extent our resources allow us to provide the services. But yes, it's expected that you serve your gifted and talented students.
Yeah, well, I'm with Donna and Kitty on this one. If it's expected that we do that, I believe we need to find a way to do that.
Well, on the other hand, isn't everything we do subject to resources? So why do we have to say that here? Because subject to resources, we're going to build a new school or not. That's, everything, so.
Any other comments, or? Okay. Laura, could you please call the roll? And, whoops, sorry, nope. No, I've got this,
Voting on the change, and then you'll have to vote on the policy. Right, Laura? Okay.
yeah. And do you want to repeat the motion? Or, Donna?
Donna, could you read the motion as you want it to be stated, please?
Just remove the phrase, "to the extent resources are available for this purpose," and start with right after that. Just scratch that phrase.
Okay. The policy will read as is, however, we will strike the phrase that says, to the extent resources are available. For this purpose. Okay, I'll call the roll. Benford,
Yes.
Fuqua,
Yes.
Garcia. Yes. Gephardt. Yes. Marquis,
Yes.
Myers,
Yes.
Sergeant.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay. And now can we move on to the next item that was pulled?
Take a motion to approve the policy.
Okay, okay. All right, and so do I make that motion, or can anyone make that? Okay. I'll second, Shelley seconds. Okay, and Laura, do you want to call the roll?
This motion is to adopt the amended policy. Benford,
Yes.
Fuqua,
Yes.
Garcia. Yes. Gephardt. Yes. Marquis,
Yes.
Myers. Yes. Sergeant.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, and so now we're going to move on to the next item, 7.14, contract for real estate services. Shelley?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about this.
But do we need a motion first? We need a motion first to discuss it, I think.
Motion to
And I'll
discuss.
second it. And do we call the roll? Okay, we can do it. Right.
So I have a couple questions about this. One has to do with the contract itself, and the other has to do with whether this is dedicated or not. So I'll start with the first question. I'm just not sure why we're signing a contract right now before we've determined what the market price of the property is. It seems as if, I know the last time we were considering putting this on the market, I believe we said we were in no hurry because property values were low then, and we were going to wait until they got higher. So I'm not sure why we wouldn't do that same thing now, do a market analysis, find out what it's worth, decide then whether we want to enter into a contract. So I guess I don't understand the timing of this, so if anyone can clarify that, that would be helpful. Yeah.
So the first run we did at this a few years back, we did it at a kind of a bid system, and it really did not work very well for this property since they're separate properties, and to be able to coordinate that many different bids with staff, we really weren't set up for that. So we considered that process wasn't very effective. So this time around, when we were looking at selling, we thought a more comprehensive approach with bidding services from a provider who can manage those all those different bids and also provide valuations for the property as part of their service was the approach we were going to take this time around.
So we could enter into a contract and then find out they're not offering us what we think it's
So
worth
this
any-
contract is for real estate services.
Right.
So we can turn down any contract or anything that comes before us. This is only for the service provider, who's the real estate company who is selling the property.
I just have never entered into a contract with a realtor without understanding what my asking price was. So,
Yeah, and we've talked with them, and we included that as part of the scope, was that they would help us with that.
okay, that's helpful, thank you. And then the second question has to do with the dedication. I am still unclear whether this was a dedication or not. I know that we have our legal analysis, but I also have some conflicting information here. So, and I thought, this is one piece of information that is contrary to that, which is an article written by Amy Bounds for the Camera 7 years ago, where she says that the property was dedicated to Boulder Valley as a school site when the neighborhood was built. And I believe that information may have come from Don Orr, And there's also, I believe, a warranty deed in existence that says that we paid $10 for the dedicated rights. So I'm really confused about whether it's dedicated land or not.
Well, we were too. So we really had to sort through all of that. There was a lot of initial talks that I think our first assessment when we looked at this property, there are papers in the file that mention a dedication requirement from the county. And so we were in discussions with them. But apparently, we've found additional letters more recently that show that that never happened. We never actually received that dedication because the subdivision was complete in 1955, I believe, and we didn't receive the land till 63 or 64. So digging deeper with Dick Bump, we found additional letters, and also he looked at the tax stamps on the deeds. The tax stamps are the amount on the tax stamp is prepared based on evaluation. So he saw that and saw that there were valuations added in that transaction. So then we found additional letters, and I believe they're included in the packet. I have to go and look, that clarify that the district actually made a fee simple offer, and that we paid money as a transaction. This ultimately never turned out to be part of a dedication. So it does have a very confusing history with that, and it's being from 1950s, we don't have all of the records we would like to have to explain all that. But it seems very clear now, given the letters and the tax stamp, that this was a fee simple transaction.
So I wonder what this warranty deed is from the 60s then that said it was acquired as a dedication.
I had that exact question for Dick Bump because I've always thought you put the valuation. He said that's not uncommon when you have a real estate contract, that the sum isn't actually on the deed itself. It's reflected in the tax stamp, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on the deed. When the transaction actually transpired in a separate real estate contract, which appears to have happened in this case.
So we could have acquired it for $10, but we paid $11,000?
No, we paid $11,000. We did.
Why would we do that if we could have acquired it for 10?
We couldn't require it.
We could not have?
No.
So this warranty
That's
deed
just the warranty deed is just a nominal amount that they threw on the warranty deed because the actual price is agreed upon in a separate a real estate agreement. And paid. And the other aspect of it, too, was the fact that it was a contingency, so we put some money down on the property early on, like $1,100 or $1,500, and that was to hold the property for a number of years. And then we took that option later on to pay the full price. So all that was previously agreed upon in a real estate agreement.
So isn't it true that sometimes developments are completed before a dedication is made, or they're simultaneous, or, I mean, there's no requirement that the development not be completed first or be completed first before the land is dedicated?
Depending on the agreements. Yeah, you would have to have some kind of binding agreement that holds the real estate agent, even after the development's finished, to follow through with his dedication.
And that was not the case in this?
Not that we can find. Okay. We found no such agreement, no.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Donna has a question.
So being new to the board and not knowing much about this real estate contract, I do have a question on what's the purpose of the district selling it, and without knowing kind of what kind of money we're gonna make?
Well, we do have, actually, this property has probably seems to go through a review of property valuation about every 5 to 10 years, and we have numerous going back to the 70s, so we've clearly thought about selling this property in the past as a district. The most recent was the one we did for the last one, and put all of the properties around 1.5 million. So we do have a general ballpark of where it's at, but these are also very unique properties. There's not a lot of open properties and comparables, especially 8 acres with services in Boulder, and so the property valuation we got last time was understood to be very tricky. So we did want some guidance from a real estate agency to help us sort through that as well, because it's a tricky valuation.
Well, was that valuation based on those services being already there, or have those been put in just recently?
The last time we put in water and sewer to the big lot, the other lots had it all along. We did it to the big lot in 2013, I believe, but the district did, prior to before we put it on the market. So that valuation is built into them having full water and sewer services.
Well, I'll just comment, I think it's a great idea to get a third party to help with this, because I don't think we have that kind of expertise in-house, and that seems to make a lot of sense to me. Any other comments? Michelle?
Gwen, I appreciate your explanation of this very complicated transaction that happened, 50-some years ago? But, you know, I still feel like I'm not going to vote for, I am not going to vote for this, just because I am still sort of unclear, and I'd like to do a little more research on it. That's not to deny anything that you said or anything Dick said, that I just want to be really clear that this was not dedicated land. And so, you know, I'd actually like to make a motion that we postpone this again until we get that total clarity.
Do you want to make a motion? Or Sam, did you want to say something?
What are you looking for, or who are you looking to get you that info? I'm just in considering whether I'll vote to delay.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there are documents about this, and I just like to read them myself. It's not that I'm going to ask anybody for them. I'm going to find them myself and just read them so that I have a better understanding of whether it was dedicated or not.
I thought when we read the opinion from the attorneys that all those questions were answered. Were they not?
Well, that's what I'm saying. For me, I'd rather read the documents myself and just understand it better. I'm not saying that our attorney's opinion was not right, or what Glenn's saying is not right. I just would be taking that, you know, on face value without really understanding it. And I feel like I shouldn't be voting for something I don't really understand, so.
Can I ask a question of Glenn? What's our timeline like on this? I'm actually very comfortable with where we are and can vote for it, but I just want to know what kind of timeline we have.
I mean, it'd be a market timeline essentially, unless the bond has some other ideas about the funds. But going into spring is the best time to have this prepared and on the market for a sale.
So it wouldn't be a dramatic impact to wait until the next board meeting, until February?
No.
So a question I would have also is, what did the neighboring people say that are surrounding this property about the sale of it?
About the sale. So we did some public meetings in 2013 regarding the sale. And there were some concerns in the public who would like that site to be retained as open space in its current form. And we've talked with with Boulder City over the years, and the open space department's not interested in any kind of acquisition. That was the primary concern. And I do have some notes from that period. We could get more.
Is the public aware that we're having this conversation? No one showed up to public participation.
We haven't done a new notice for this round of sale, but the public has been made aware of our intent to sell the property as late as 2013 and 2014, and that would continue.
Shelley, do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I move that we postpone taking action on this until the next board meeting, basically. Yeah.
So Shelley, this has been on the agenda for a while. Does that give you enough time? Because I don't want
I
to
think
keep
so, yeah.
postponing it. And
Yeah, I
so-
think this really helped me understand what I'm looking for now.
So you won't ask for another because I just don't want to keep kicking it down the road when it sounds like spring is the good time to do this, so.
Well, I'm not, yeah, I said next board meeting, and I'm not asking randomly. I'm asking based on the information we got from our lawyers and tonight, so.
One last question, or it's not a question, just a comment. I do like having a little more time, because I'm just learning about this and read through all of these as they came out. But I think I heard you correctly, you said 2013 was when you had the community meeting. So that's 4 years ago. And I just want to make sure that the community has enough, that the surrounding people and properties has enough information that we're seeing, that I'm not voting against something they're so opposed to.
Okay, are we ready to call the vote on this? Roll?
Who made the second? I didn't hear it.
Donna.
Donna, okay, thanks. I just wanted to clarify. Okay, I'll call the roll. Benford,
Yes.
Fuqua,
Yes.
Garcia,
Yes.
Gebhardt. Marquis,
Yes.
Myers,
Yes.
Sargent.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, and then we have our last item that was pulled, 7.15, Resolution 18-01, Respectful Workplace Commitment. Can we have a motion? Shelley?
I move to discuss this.
I'll second it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I don't remember doing that ever. That's. Yep. Okay, so I guess when I read this resolution, I was a little confused because it's not really in resolution form. So, that's my first question. If it's a resolution, why isn't it written like one? And my second question is, if this is a sort of a general statement on workplace respect, I think that that's fine, and I'm not sure why that's necessary. I think we've done the trainings, but I'm fine with doing that. But if this is meant to address the issue that we faced this past fall and be our response to that, I think it's really inadequate. And so when you lead into it and it says, at times the demands and stressful challenges of our work, studies, and personal lives can occasionally lead to moments of impatience and irritability, like, that's not what we were talking about. So I think that this sends a really confusing message to me about what we're trying to address with this. So that's why I pulled it. If you were to say, Cindy, this is meant to be a general statement about workplace respect, this is not meant to address the issue we came up against last fall, it's not in relationship to that, I would say, fine, I have no objection. But if you are saying that this is what we're doing in response to what happened last fall, I would say, not enough, and I don't want to put it out there as our only response to that.
I think it's a fair question. I think, and the way I would respond is to say, I think both parts of what you've brought up contributed to this. I think that, yes, we know that Boulder Valley went through quite a trauma, and we need to deal with that. But then second of all, we want an overall statement around respectful workplaces, because we think this fits in with how we would expect people to behave with each other in the variety of workplaces that we have. So I guess, Shelley, my response is both, in a way. And if it doesn't meet your needs about making a statement, and I think you mean last spring, not last fall? Unless I'm not thinking of the right thing. Okay. If this doesn't meet your needs, then we can develop another statement. But this really covers us for all of our work environments.
And I didn't know, Sam, did you want to speak a little bit to it, since I think you initiated
Yeah,
this?
I think I came out of a work session discussion about the respectful workplace trainings, and a sense I had at the time as the board president that the board wanted to make a statement about that. I asked Mike to draft something. I saw the first draft, and this may be different, but that's, I think, how this one started. So, last
Yeah.
August or September, I think.
Right, well,
Yeah.
we do respectful workplace training where I work, and it's not meant to address anything specific. It's meant to address sort of a general culture of respect. So I think that, I thought what we were coming with was a strong resolution against harassment, and that is not this. So I'm fine if you're saying we need this anyway as part of our environment. That's good, although it's not written like a resolution again. But I would say we need more. And so if you're saying that we're open to writing another resolution that more directly addresses the issue that came before us this past spring, then I would say yes, and I'd be happy to help write that resolution if need be. So.
Let me check with the rest of the board. We're happy to develop another resolution if that's the preference of the board. We feel that this one addresses workplaces ranging from schools to departments all across the system. That said, if we get possibly it should be a motion that you want another resolution, which we can do.
Well, and the other option is to view this as the general resolution around respectful workplace, and then to bring up an agenda setting, a further item, because we don't have anything in our agenda pipeline. So that might be something for agenda setting if there's something different you're looking to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. If that's a possibility and we're still moving in that direction, then then I'd be fine with this as not intending to address the other.
Yeah, and I don't know if we're moving in that direction. We haven't discussed it. We haven't come to a consensus on that. But I'd put it on agenda setting for us to talk about.
Okay, and then I do just have the technical question about this not being a resolution.
The whereas thing.
Yeah, it's not a resolution, so.
You're right, it doesn't have resolution language.
So should we alter it
I'm
and then
sorry,
bring
what?
it back in 2 weeks? Should we change it to a
Sure.
resolution format?
Do you want
and
to
bring it back
change
in
to
2 weeks?
resolution form? Sure,
Okay.
we can do that.
All right. So then we probably need a motion then to not approve this resolution. Do you want to make that motion? To postpone, yeah.
Yeah.
You could vote no.
It was just
That was just
discussion,
discussed,
yeah.
yeah.
So I move to postpone this agenda item until we can write it in a resolution format. Yeah.
Laura, would you like to call the roll?
Okay, I have Shelley raising the motion and Tina seconding it, correct? Okay. Okay, Benford,
Yes.
Fuqua,
Yes.
Garcia,
Yes.
Gebhardt. Yes. Marquis,
Yes.
Myers,
Yes.
Sargent.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, is there anything we need to do to close out these action items, or are we all set to move on? I'm going to ask Laura and Melissa. We've got everything? Okay. All right, so let's move on to our study items. Study 9.1 is the 2017-2018 revised budget. And we're going to have Bill Sutter talk to us about this.
Okay, so we have a brief PowerPoint presentation, and then certainly we can answer any questions you may have. We'll be talking about two specific funds in detail, although all the other funds for the district are attached to the agenda item with the changes noted. First, to look at the beginning balance changes for the general operating fund. We have identified carryover items and then variance in net revenues and expenditures from the adopted budget, last year's adopted budget, and ending fund balance. So we have an increase in available resources there. I'm going to take a couple of minutes here to focus on the revenue side. There were some significant changes by individual line item within revenues, particularly because there was an article in the business section of the Daily Camera that talked about a windfall of revenues for the district. So this pretty clearly lays out that there was not a windfall of revenues to the district due to the increase in the assessed valuation within Boulder Valley. While that was fairly significant, and we have an increase in property taxes collected, 23.5 million projected, we have a $25 million drop in the state sources from the School Finance Act. There are a few other minor changes. Overall, ongoing revenue is expected to change by about $300,000, which is essentially the Medicaid change. So clearly there is not a windfall of revenue due to the increase in local property taxes. This is a function of the School Finance Act, and the state has reduced that revenue to the district and for districts across the state. I believe the delta at the state level is about $110 million for less students being funded, as well as the property tax increases across the state. So just wanted to make that pretty clear. On the expenditure side, we have our standard carryover items. The standard carryover items are the school resource allocation, textbooks, the READ Act, Medicaid, and the Board of Education professional development funds, which are primarily focused around the CASB conference. Some of these are practices that we've had for a long time on the standard carryover items, particularly SRA, textbook, and the Board of Education, but it's a legal matter around the READ Act and Medicaid. Those dollars are required to be spent on those programs if they're not spent in the year the revenue is collected. Next, we have special carryover requests from schools, departments, and district-wide, and then also one-time funding requests. So I want to be a little clear on what the difference between a carryover request versus a one-time funding request is, as there's a little nuance to it. So if a department or a school is given some resources in the particular budget year to undertake a particular activity or buy a certain item, and those resources are unspent, the request may be made to use those funds in the next year. It is a carryover request if it's for the same item, same action, same professional development, whatever it might be. If the resources are unspent and the department or school would like to do something different or request to use some additional revenue that was collected in the district for a one-time expenditure, that's what we consider a one-time funding request. So they're sort of a separate item, although they both act in the same way as being a one-time expense for the district. So I just wanted to clarify that. Next, we have our ongoing expenditures, some software, summer school, and a security monitor. Tax collection fees, which is the lion's share of this $200,000 change. We pay almost $600,000 to collect our own money from the counties for property taxes. It's a pretty significant chunk of money. It's 1/4% that we pay to do that. Districts up and down the Front Range that are heavy property tax reliant also see the same impact, but it's a number that's grown significantly over the years. I think it was about $250,000 when I first started way back when. The READ Act, we have a drop in revenue. The number of students that qualifying for the literacy plan has gone down, so we have a corresponding drop in the revenues related to that. So ongoing expenditures increased by $400,000, 5.8 million total expenditure increase. Transfers and reserves. So net transfers don't change. We have a one-time transfer to capital reserve. That specific project is funding for cameras on buses. Certainly can be discussion about whether that is the move that needs to be made or will be made, but at least the funding is set aside for that. And then charter schools counted fewer students in the charter schools, so they get less funding because they have fewer students. And then for the 3% TABOR and 3% contingency reserve, we have additional expenditures. We have increased reserves there. This table just wraps up all the changes, summarizes it from what the adopted budget was, the ending balance, the changes, and then the revised budget. We do have a budgeted ending fund balance of $3.9 million, an increase of about $3 million over what was adopted back in June. Next, I have the Operations and Technology Fund. This, I wanted to point out the increase in revenues here relative to the fixed mills associated with this override. So with an increase in assessed valuation, we did see some additional revenue in this particular fund. This is, again, just held at the ending fund balance for future needs at this point in time. They can be allocated or appropriated throughout the rest of the year. They don't have to be done at this particular moment, but they are available. And lastly, a little quick summary here. We have the final adoption scheduled for January 23rd, and certainly adjustments can be made if additional information comes along.
Is that it?
That's it.
All right, board members, any questions? Michelle, you had a question earlier. Do you want to? Wrote to the camera about explaining this whole thing to the public. I thought it was really helpful. So thanks for doing that. So standard carryover in revenue, okay, is SRA, textbooks, Medicaid, and board PD. Those are the categories.
Redact and redact.
And redact, okay. And those are all things that we received money for, but we did not spend on in the year that we received the money for, and that's why it's carried over?
In Medicaid and redact, that is typically the case, that it's unspent revenue. In the case of the school resource allocation or textbooks, it's could be perpetual money that has been carried over for a while. We just sort of calculate what that total leftover bucket is within those line items and set that aside.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be that year, could have been many years before. Okay. And so the standard carryover items under expenditures are the same thing? Is that, or is that something different?
Yes. On the resources side, we have identified carryover, 4.3 million, which is the combination of the 3.8 standard and the 0.5 special carryover.
Remind me of the special carryover, what's that?
Those are specific requests by departments or schools for dollars that were allocated for a specific purpose to carry those over and use them for the same purpose in the next year. But wouldn't normally carry over unless they were specifically asked for.
Okay. Can you just explain in the very simplest terms how we, did we expect to end up with $9 million in additional revenue 3 months ago? Could we have anticipated this, or is this news that?
The, let's see, in the audit, we went through and looked at what the differences were. I don't remember the details, how much was revenue versus how much was underspending budgets. I know salaries and benefits did not come in as high as expected, so that was certainly one area that was unanticipated. There are a lot of year-end expenditures related to salaries and benefits, vacation payouts, things like that, that we don't know until well into July. So they're historical, they happen, we know they happen, but we don't know the specific amount until people can ask for it, because there are different levels of what can be asked for to be paid out for vacations and things like that.
How much of that accounts for this number?
I don't know off the
No,
top of my head. We
okay.
can find that easy enough.
So I just remember discussing, not arguing, but discussing for, it seemed like an eternity, whether we could have $250,000 for dyslexia. And being told there's absolutely not that amount of money available to us. And now, a few months later, there appears to be plenty of money available for that. So, I'm happy to see it, but
I wish during those discussions that, it would be clear that these don't have to be, these so contentious, because in the end, there may actually be money for this, and just be patient. I mean, that kind of message, I think, would be helpful when we're having those discussions. So just to go back to this standard carryover now. So one of the things DAC told us was that the school resource allowance is one of the school's high priorities, right, to return that? So is this saying then that we have that money, and it's a pot of money that we've had for quite a while, that we could now release for that purpose to the schools?
So,
Or can we use that money for other stuff? I mean, or is that dedicated pot of money just for SRA?
it is dedicated just for the SRA.
Okay.
The schools are very much expecting those resources. We have allowed 100% carryover for, I'm not sure in my 20-something years here that we have ever said you can't have your carryover as a school. We
Okay.
used to limit the carryover to 10% of an annual amount. So if you had $100, you could only carry over $10 if you had $100 to spend at the beginning of the year. But we changed that practice, I think in one of the earlier economic downturns before the big one, because schools said, we can't save and we can't plan if we don't end up buying things at the end of the year that you don't really need. But it's also negative carryover. So there are schools that have negative amounts. They made a choice to spend something early, which is fine. They just have to plan that into their following year, but they're very much planning on all those dollars. The school resource allocation is about $340,000 of that. 3.5 million of that 3.8 is textbooks and Medicaid. So most of it is, it's about half and half, textbooks and
Okay.
Medicaid.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, and I know I've been in departments just recently where, and you kind of answered my question, but there's end of the year fish feeding frenzy kind of thing about spend it, use it, or lose it. So I understand you to say that that's not the practice now. It can be carried over to,
I would hope that anybody who is managing a budget would have some fiscal responsibility about not just buying things willy-nilly at the end of the year, because it's perfectly okay to ask for those resources in the following year, either for the same purpose or to repurpose for another activity or expenditure or something. So yes, there is no need to spend something at the end of the year. If there's money available and you have a good argument as to spending it on something, then the department can certainly make that decision, the department leader.
and then another question under the proposed budget one-time expenditures. That K-5 English Language Arts core materials, is part of, enveloped in that, the structured literacy materials?
That is a new item, so that is a new one-time request for professional development related to rolling out those materials that were adopted previously.
Okay. And then the staffing reserve, can you explain that one?
Part of that, half of it is for paraeducators, for students' short-term needs, particularly at the elementary level, for students with some higher needs that may not be identified for special ed or something like that. And then the other half is for some administrative supports at a couple of schools.
Any other comments, board members, or questions? Kathy?
I was just curious about your comment that you put aside money for cameras on buses, and where that came from and why buses and not other requests for cameras.
Well, partially, it's 300,000 versus a few million, so there's some scope in the dollar amount there. The ability to implement the buses is a lot easier than within the buildings. And the decision hasn't been made officially yet, so it's just a resource available.
And where is that in here?
In cap reserve, the transfer,
cap
the
reserve.
one-time transfer to
Okay.
cap reserve.
And we don't need a policy change for cameras on buses, just in the schools, correct?
Let Melissa answer that.
Okay. Because I thought there was a policy issue around cameras. But maybe, we already have cameras in some buses, don't we? Yeah, okay.
So, Tina. So, what would be some like competing projects that might be transferred to capital reserve? Or a cost that we would include in the capital reserve, like we're choosing bus cameras? Like, what are some other things that might be in there that we as a board haven't talked about whether we want bus cameras or not?
Correct. So we did put $1 million in there in the original budget adopted back in June into cap reserve. So it's everything from vehicles to when the water main broke out behind here last year, to roofs to, it's
Okay.
everything.
Okay. So originally, when we set aside that money, it was for maintenance issues that were unexpected?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? All right, so this is coming back for action in 2 weeks.
Yes.
In the interim, if you have a question, I think it makes sense to email me and Cindy and see if we can get some information in the interim so that we can work toward approving this. So that's, if that sounds like a plan for everybody. And then we can move on to our next study item, which is, and I'm not going to call it break because I think we just have one more item. Is that? I'm looking right at, sorry. I shouldn't look at any individual board member. So our next study item is 9.2, Board Policy CBA CBC. Well, it's one short item and one longer item. Melissa, did you want to come up here for, or?
This is the change that we talked about so that your policy really matches the state law. And as you hire, you don't have to have a license. So
So is everyone remembering that it's really more of a language. We have language here already that says we can waive all of this to some extent, but it's just odd that it says a license required, and then we say we can change those requirements. So
Right.
the idea is just to strike the first sentence and continue on with the rest of it. So, and this is just on study. So if anyone has any questions on this, we're not voting on this tonight. This would be the time to ask a question. Sure.
First sentence, and the rest is staying as written?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you see the red line?
Yes.
Okay, great.
It just says deleted 2, 3, and 4, but we're not deleting 2, 3, and 4.
Right, I think that's just those numbers that are being changed, the numbering. Any other questions on this one? All right, well, hearing none, I think we'll move to our next study item, 9.3, Policy IJ Instructional Materials Selection and Adoption. And I think Sam has a lot of information for us on this. Dr. Messier.
So I have with me tonight Jackie Weber, who's our Director of Mathematics, Computer Science, and Instructional Materials. And so Jackie has really led the effort over the last couple of years to gather a lot of feedback from a variety of stakeholders on tightening up our policy around instructional materials. So I'll let her share that with you.
Thank you for this opportunity. You do have the presentation provided for you. Okay. So the purpose of this update, the last time we updated this policy was in 2012, in May of 2012. And so we really, as Sam mentioned, have been working on this over a couple of years to get the policy, number one, to reflect some modern language that we're using in terms of our personnel structures, but then also to take turn the policy into a more responsive format so that we can respond more quickly to the needs of our students and teachers. The evolution of instructional materials is moving very, very quickly. And so in looking through all of the policies and all of the exhibits and regulations that were attached to it in the past, we found it to be very difficult to revise it and keep it up to date and fresh. And so part of what we're bringing to you tonight is an update that allows us to make this policy and make the procedures and the processes of adopting materials much more flexible and much more responsive so that we can respond to the needs of our students and teachers much more quickly. The key changes we're going to talk about tonight are we updated and added and revised some of the categories and titles in the procedures, and then we've streamlined some processes. The first key change we'd like to talk about is looking at a category called district-based core instructional materials. And these are approved by the school board through a process of evaluation, a very stringent actually process. Then we bring the products to you for approval. And these are approved as the required instruction materials to be used as the predominant instructional materials in a certain coursework or aligned to a certain level of standards. And so, for example, in mathematics in 2013, the school board adopted math expressions for K-5 mathematics, and that was the base in core instructional materials for mathematics at the elementary level. And so that's the required materials to use as standard instructional materials. Things can be added on, and we worked with schools around that, but that's the instructional materials for that. So that is the district-based core instructional materials. There are a few others. So district-based support materials. So again, these are instructional materials that are adopted at the district level, approved by the school board, but they're provided to extend or enrich what the core instructional materials provide. So an example of this might be specific literary novels that are adopted to support the standards and to support the core instruction materials that may be adopted for language arts at the time. Individual instructional resources are a subcategory of this, and they're really defined. And the reason we define it this way is because these are sort of temporal. These are much more responsive to what's going on in current events. They could be literary works, primary sources, things that are sort of live and active that students might access in a social studies class, for instance. Then we also have a second category along this line, and these are intervention materials. And so intervention materials are really purchased at the district level for use in schools. Could be online, could be a print, but they're specifically designed to be a part of an intervention system in a school. And they are board approved, school district approved, and funded materials specifically used for interventions. So again, in support of the core instructional materials, but to support our students who maybe have special needs above grade level or below grade level, depending on in different ways. So these expand beyond what the core instructional materials can do. One example that we have for these are approved leveled literacy interventions, and also from the Wilson Reading System. So that's an example of our interventions. So one of the things that's really important to remember with all of these new categories is we aren't eliminating any kind of oversight. There's still oversight in place. We're just defining things a little more in a more modern sense so that we have better categories so that our staff, our principals, and our public understand what kind of materials we're purchasing. The two other categories that have emerged from this revision are school-based support materials, and these are non-core materials. So these are purchased by individual schools using school-based funds. Could be SRA, could be PTO money, could be a grant they received. And these are designed to extend and enrich the core instructional materials. So these are not designed to replace core instructional materials. These are support materials to help the students to differentiate or to provide enrichment or to extend their learning. And so part of what the schools are expected to do is use the materials adoption criteria that's in the policy, in IJ, to choose these materials that they purchase at the school level. Again, there is a level of oversight from the teacher's professional, obviously professional expertise, but then also the grade levels, the school departments, the school principal, and then oftentimes they also come to the district content director to ask for advice and approval on those materials. And then, so one example of that one is, for instance, Angevine Middle School right now has purchased iReady Math for their students as a math intervention. They're paying for it from Angevine School Resources. They came to me, we talked about it, I completely approved of it, and it was their materials, their department was on board, their principal was on board. So that's an example of school-based support materials they're using for 30 students in particular who are below grade level in math. Okay. The last category then is really a formality that we felt was important to keep in there, are outdated materials. And the importance of this one is to be able to, again, have a little oversight in keeping our materials modern and fresh for our students. And one example would be during our math adoption, we did not allow our adoption committees to look at materials that were prior to copyright 2012 because of the new standards. So the materials from 2012 or above would not have met those requirements. And even though they wanted to look at some materials that were already in use, those were outdated materials. And so we didn't allow those to be considered for the adoption. So sometimes that happens as new materials come around and as we move into adoption cycles. Some may want to consider some older materials that are already in place, and if they're outdated, then we would ask them to not consider those. Right. So the second key change we're doing is streamlining the process. And for this, again, we are moving the regulations and exhibits out of policy and moving them into a procedures guide for content directors. Our content directors run the materials adoptions for their specific contents. And so what this allows us to do is really keep those procedures responsive, and we can adapt those every year as we need it, and we can keep those up to date without needing to come back and do a policy change every single time. And so, as I mentioned, we haven't updated these for 6 years. So we went through a really rigorous updating of those and moved those into the procedures guide for content directors so that we can continue to update those as we move towards more innovative materials and looking at different things. The other reasons we like to do this is to reduce the inconsistencies in the policies and the associated documents. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but we had something around 12 different documents that were defining this policy. So what we wanted to do was really reduce that and make it a really clear philosophical document around what we believe is the policy for adopting materials and keeping the day-to-day procedural procedures and documents separate for the faculty to use those later. So what we removed specifically were forms and timelines, and we did that for a number of reasons. For example, the forms to evaluate included the quality over the overhead transparencies. We haven't used an overhead transparency in a classroom for many, many years. So one of the things that this allows us to do is sort of update things as we go. So we took out overhead transparencies, we took out CD-ROMs. Instead of having to bring that back to you every time, we need to revise that with different text specs and things like that. This allows us to make this flexible as technology evolves, which we know is happening at a rapid pace. The other thing, it allows us to move to a digital form for submitting reviews, for public review. That used to be all done on paper. So a materials adoption created mounds and mounds of paper. And so what we've also done now is digitized a lot of that. And so to move it into a procedures guide allows us to keep that updated and take feedback from the public and revise those forms and keep them really, really fresh. And then finally, what we found this year is by moving these into a procedures document, it helps us be really responsive in terms of timelines. So previously, the timeline was in policy. So in a regulation, yeah. And it was basically the adoption approvals had to come to you in February. Like that was in policy. And so we would like to make this a little more flexible so that we could bring it to you when it's responsive and best for our students' needs. So one example we wanted to provide for you was the idea of what it looks like for that school-based instructional materials, so that category. So if a teacher finds some materials that they would really like to use, they will contact Ann Hamilton, who is our administrative assistant for materials adoption, and look to see, and Ann will look at it to see if it's on our approved list. If it's on the approved list and it may be approved for district funds, then they can talk to the director and find out if they want to use it. They can go ahead and use their school funds for that. If they're seeking to use school funds for that, if they're not on the approved list, then they work with the content director and the principal to have those materials approved. Once that's done, then they may be approved for school-based funds. So the teachers still have flexibility, but there's still a level of oversight involved. So even though we're moving things to procedures and into a guide for directors, we're not removing the oversight or the flexibility for teachers. So we're really maintaining a lot of that integrity without having it be a really burdensome policy. So over the years, we have been working on revising these, and the final slide then is just a list of people who have been involved in this revision. So obviously myself, all the content director, Sam, all of the assistant superintendents, all the cabinet members. The district coordinating council has reviewed this twice, actually, and taken a look at different versions of it. Tina Mew and the Boulder Valley Education Leadership have looked at it, as well as information and education technology and our legal department. So that's an overview, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Shelley?
Thank you for that. It looks like a lot of hard work has gone into this, and I can see lots of improvements here. I do have a question about the first line on the first page, where selection was changed to approval. I mean, we all know you select the materials, we don't, but this has been the language for 40-some years, so why now would we change that, I guess? That does feel very different to me.
Yeah, so I think you're just questioning about the changing of the word from selection to approval.
Right.
I think we were just really trying to be clear about the fact that the board's role is to approve the materials, but they delegate the selection process to staff to facilitate that with our teachers and our parents and our community members.
Right, and I guess I'm saying that's always been the case.
It has,
So, I mean, and yet this language has been in there for 40-some years, so.
I guess we were just trying to be more precise with our language.
So it makes me think about those boards that, in less liberal districts, that concern themselves with, what books high schoolers are reading or whatever. And, this still allows for a board to say, no, we don't want you reading The Bluest Eye in ninth grade or something.
Absolutely.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. And then I
And the
have,
board still has that final say over it. You're just delegating to us sort of the professional selection.
right. And so then in I guess my only sort of any objection to this at all is in paragraph 3, where it seems like what we're saying is that we've sort of downgraded the instructional resources and materials from supporting the district's educational objectives to supporting their mission and values and goals. And it seems to me that they should be about academic standards.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We debated about that quite a few times and kind of went back and forth with it and felt that the direction of the district had really been lately around the mission, vision, and goals, and what's in there is really academic in a lot of ways.
And the criteria also talks about kind of meeting the needs of the whole child as well. So we did talk about that and whether or not we wanted to change that language. We felt it was better aligned with sort of a lot of what we've been talking about as a district and our district direction to put in the mission, vision, and goals.
Do you think it could say both?
I think you could.
Yeah, I think it
Yeah,
could.
I don't see any objection to including the language about helping students meet the academic
Yeah,
standards.
I think that would be helpful. So, thank you.
And I have a question. Did you think about modifying just the inspection process? I know that we have some materials on review right now, and I need to drive out here, and now I think I need to make an appointment. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to make that a little more virtual. It seems there are some barriers with the geographic, you know.
Yeah, we recognize that does present some problems. So some of the materials are available digitally, but because these are materials that we haven't purchased yet, publishers are very hesitant to give us, to allow us to provide online access to anyone who wants to come and view them. Hence why we have physical copies that we ask people to come in and view or use the Chromebook that has the one login that the publisher has provided for us on site. Publishers are hesitant to let us digitize those and push those out publicly.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick on the number 9, we might want to reference, since we just adopted the district's policy on data privacy, reference that on the cross-reference.
Oh, thank you, Donna. Yeah, we should add that as a cross-reference.
Another question? I don't know where I saw this, but we're reapproving math expressions support materials or something, and it brought me back to when we originally approved those. And I remember that the materials weren't finished at the time. And so there was a discussion about whether we were adopting materials that weren't complete yet. And we ended up doing it anyway, but it still left that question, I think, hanging out there. And I noticed there's nothing in here about that. And I'm wondering what our position on that, because I was always uncomfortable with that to start with, and I'm still uncomfortable with it, and I don't know if we have anything like that in the hopper, but what's our position on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, that was Connected Math, which was our
Okay.
middle grade.
Yes, that's right.
And we don't do consumables for that one, so we got our final productions and
Okay.
and we work for those. But just to clarify that.
Yep.
And we don't have that necessarily in here. That could definitely be something that we look at. What we're considering doing as part of the procedure is the new RFP process. And we're working closely with purchasing to figure out what that would look like, so that, and that's something that I think that's a great idea for putting into that contract language of, the materials should be complete. We should have a complete sample before we consider purchasing, things like that. I think that's some language that we could definitely put into our RFP contract that we're working on with purchasing right now.
And you don't think it has a place here in this policy, though, for adoption of instructional materials?
I think I think we definitely could. We have much more sort of philosophical criteria listed and less of that sort of, I don't know, legal. But I think if the board feels like that's an appropriate thing to put in there, we could certainly do that.
Okay.
Yeah, we could maybe play with some language
That
to
would be
see
great.
about
Just-
what it would look like to include something about ensuring that we have all of the evidence necessary to evaluate the materials based on the criteria
Yes.
set by the board.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
It was really a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if that's it, again, this is on study, and same with the budget. If you have further questions, if you reread this, to email Cindy and me, and then we can work on those in the interim. So, and this will come back for approval in 2 weeks. Okay, thanks so much. All right, so our last item is agenda setting. And I'm going to kick off. We don't have on our agenda setting, even though we know we need to do it, are the committees, assigning people for committees like the legislative liaisons or the Boulder City committee, so I'll make a note that we'll get that on the next board meeting. What other items do board members have? Yes, you came up with, you wanted to put on the agenda setting a possible discussion around harassment. Okay. I'm writing it down.
Well, at some point, I don't know if this would be at our quarterly planning meetings or where, but I'd certainly like to take the temperature of my board colleagues on looking at the process by which we align the start times for our schools with best practice for student health and optimal learning.
Okay. That sounds great. Kitty?
As a result of the request we had from the chair of the Boulder County Democratic Party, and the Republicans, I'm sure, would agree with it, is I think we need to look at making a policy around caucus and making our schools available to the political parties.
Anything else?
Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it looks like we have increased resources in our operational mill, and it came up during our work session earlier. I'd just like to get a better understanding of how we've paid for our operations and our maintenance and what that would look like if we were to go forward. I don't think we've had a presentation on what that's looked like historically and how we might need to change that, because I think historically we've relied on bond proceeds, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that going forward.
Anybody else? And I don't know when we have our next quarterly planning meeting, because I think some of these things will fall in that. Is that? Oh, but we have our
We
retreat.
don't have one set. We have a board retreat. I touched base with our facilitator for the quarterly planning, but because we've got so many other pieces and parts going on this winter and into spring, I wasn't quite sure where to set it.
Okay, so we'll talk about that agenda
Okay.
setting. All right. Any further items for the agenda? Okay, with that, I'd like to adjourn our meeting.